Ready? Here we go. Hello and welcome to Ctrl-Alt-Speech live at TrustCon 2025. That was great. We should do this all the time. This is your weekly podcast on the news about online speech, trust and safety, internet regulation, and all things of that nature. Folks who are regular listeners to the podcast will note that normally the intro is done by Ben and his wonderful British accent. Ben is not here, as you'll notice. We have talked about it on the podcast that he won't be here, but he did send in this picture of the reason why he is not here. That is Ben and his brand new lovely child wearing a onesie with the Ctrl-Alt-Speech logo on it, and it says, just a baby, but this is for people who are listening to the podcast. I'm explaining the visual imagery, but already into speech podcasts. So Ben cannot make it. He sends his apologies for not making it. He is definitely suffering from FOMO based on the number of text messages I have received from him today. But instead of Ben, we have a lovely panel here. I will switch Ben off the screen and back to our logo. We were supposed to have 4 panelists. Unfortunately, one of our panelists had to drop out at the last minute. But I think we can fill the space just fine with who we have here. So
we'll do a rest.
You'll do fine. Again, I don't know if I said I'm Mike Masnick from TechDirt and Copy Institute. And we have Alice Hunsberger, who, again, everybody knows you here, right?
If you don't know me, you should subscribe to Everything in Moderation, which is Ben's newsletter, who he lets me write for. Yeah.
Yes.
That's how you can learn more about who I am if you don't know.
And then at the end, we have Ashken Kazaryan. And now I feel like I have to say what you write, but you do everything. So do you want to just give a quick intro on your current work?
I'm a First Amendment lawyer, which means I'm having a great time in the year of 2025. And most of my work focuses on digital free speech at the future of free speech at the Vanderbilt University.
All right, so regular listeners of the podcast will know the way this works is that we generally have a discussion about things that have happened in the news this week. We have picked out a bunch of articles that we have decided are interesting and that where there are complicated things where we don't have easy answers for them, I think will be the quick upfront summary of the things we are about to discuss. And we are going to try to make sure that towards the end of this, we will have some time for user questions. There are microphones on the side, and so we will give you a little bit of heads up and people can line up. There are very bright lights shining in our eyes, so we will try to be able to see. My eyesight is not as good as it used to be, but hopefully we can see you and have you answer a question, or ask a question. We will do the answering. Already I'm messed up with all the lights. All right, so we're gonna start with a story or a couple of stories that, Ash, you found having to do with our favorite property to talk about, which is X, and the Grok AI that is on X. So do you want to give a quick summary of the stories that you found?
Sure, I'll be very quick. One of the stories from Al Jazeera talks about how much Grok has been used by users for fact-checking. And they mostly draw on 2 events in our history, one being National Guard being in LA and Governor of California, where we are, Newsom posting 2 pictures, and then a lot of users using Grok to see if the pictures were real, and Grok incorrectly saying that they weren't, and then the fallout from that. And then the second one had to do with Elon Musk making a statement about the president and the Epstein files and the fallout from that. And overall, I think the article talks about how more and more, because Grok is integrated into social media platform like X, users use it more and more for fact-checking and quick answers, and then rely on that and the upsides and downsides of that.
Yeah, and I thought this was really interesting, both of them, in fact, because, there's been all this talk for years about the importance of fact checking, and there's a lot of mis and disinformation, as people at this conference are very well aware of, and we're always saying better fact checking is important, and here's a tool that in theory helps people fact check. And then what the Al Jazeera article was noting was that it was giving wrong answers. It wasn't fact checking, it was doing the opposite of it. But I also thought what was interesting was the fact that so many people are using the tool that way. The Grok, is it true response to any particular piece of information is becoming something that a lot of people are using. And I thought it's just sort of like an interesting element that there's at least some element of people wanting to get a fact check, wanting to try and get some sort of confirmation or some way to know if what they're looking at is true. And I thought that was a positive, but the fact that Grok sometimes responds with nonsense is a problem.
I was looking for a number. Between June 5th and June 12th, Grok was called on 2.3 million times, which is a wild number. I did not realize that. I see it all the time on my feed, and I judge people who do it, to be honest. But yeah, that's a number I did not imagine.
Yeah. Do you have
Yeah, I mean, I always have thoughts. I think it speaks more widely. I mean, we all know if we use AI every day, like I do in my job, we know where you have to fact check the AI, even if it's supposed to be fact checking for you. Like I always take this extra step to check. And I think this sort of speaks to a lack of media literacy and AI literacy generally. And I wonder, in the trust and safety space, what is our responsibility to try to teach people how to use these tools and understand what the limitations are, and how much is something that we as a society more generally have to do. And it's really not like a trust and safety issue so much as it is just new technology that people haven't figured out yet. And so I have a couple stories coming up next that I also speak to the same similar theme. So,
and as a First Amendment lawyer, I also feel very conflicted about this. But first and foremost, I think it's an additional tool that some of our institutions can use and hopefully perfect. And maybe it's not just Grok, maybe other social media platforms implement something like that. We now see community notes being the most popular way to do some of the content moderation around this. So I think it's just another tool in a toolbox as we keep adapting to new information ecosystem. And as long as it's not the government that tells Grok what to do, I'm okay with that.
Well, yeah. I mean, the government made some statements about AI today, which may not influence, but I think it actually does raise a larger point, which is who has control over the AI systems, which is something that people don't think about. And I know, with Grok in particular, I think there was a post that Elon made today that I think it was today. It was one of these things that went across my feed. I haven't fact checked it. I could be wrong. But where someone was saying, it was yelling at Elon, you have to get the bias out of Grok. And he said, we're working on it. And there's this element to all of this, which is, who is controlling the tools that you're using for these purposes. And that's always been an element of any of these things. Like when we had, back when there was fact checking on social media and Meta had, fact checking.
RIP.
Yes, had their fact checking programs in place. There were still questions about it, and people would say, well, but they would disagree with this fact check, and it depends on what context you're adding or how you're looking at it. But now we have these tools like Grok, and there's a question of who is in charge of the dials in terms of how those things are being tuned and what they're being tuned for. And obviously, a few weeks ago, Grok was referring to itself as Mecha Hitler, which, do you trust Mecha Hitler to be your accurate fact-checking thing? Hopefully not that many people in this audience would assume that would be a good fact-checking thing. But I think there's this element of it's one thing to say, okay, yes, you should be checking on things, and you should be curious, and you should be trying to figure out, is this a trustworthy source? And so it's good to see people, trying to find that, but the fact that they're then relying on an untrustworthy source to determine whether or not the sources they're looking at are trustworthy leads to this sort of inception level of do your own research.
At the same time, I do want to say, I don't think this is like a new problem. Maybe the scale is different just because of the internet and its scale is humongous. But at the same time, 20 years ago, 10 years ago, if you were watching Fox News versus watching MSNBC, you were maybe getting slightly different version of the events and description of the events. And same applies to newspapers and book publishers. And the question of who your audience is and where do you go to get information adjusts how you get that information and what's in that information. So I do want to reiterate that this is not a new problem.
Yeah, but is it different in a way? Because it's one thing to say about, okay, yeah, I'm going to pick, I'm going to watch Fox News, or I'm going to watch MSNBC, or I'm going to watch CNN or whatever. But there's something different about the fact that it's like an AI, and even the fact that people believe because it's like, oh, it's an AI, it's an algorithm, that there's some sort of truth behind it. And I mean, this is just what I'm noticing. People sort of, and this is going to come up in later stories that we're talking about today as well, there's this sense that like, people know to not always trust a human, but they seem to be, in some cases at least, certainly not always, but perhaps more willing to trust, well, the machine told me, and it's got some sort of quality, some nature that makes people believe that it must be true.
I think yes, and we'll talk about that, and also. There's something about truth and facts that is very interesting right now, and I think a lot of it is kind of self-reinforcing. And so for a lot of people, they're really looking for reinforcement of their own beliefs and their own worldview, more so than actually wanting the truth to challenge them. And so there's this feedback mechanism that can get pretty sketchy if it goes too far down any one direction. And what I've said for a long time is I think trust and safety teams are like the way that companies put their values into action. So if X believes in whatever Elon Musk believes in and wants his worldview to be out in the world, and Grok is checking Elon Musk's tweets to like reinforce that in the bot, like that's kind of what people are coming to X for, and they're being pretty upfront about that, and we're seeing all the ways that it comes out wrong, but it's also the values of the company, even if some of us don't agree with that. And so it's an interesting thing to think about, like, is it a feature, is it a bug, or is it both? Like, hard to say.
And there's an element of confirmation bias in the users too, right? Because in some cases, users are looking for, this is something that I think is somewhat underexplored, just even in the social media space, where people talk about concerns about filter bubbles or echo chambers or whatever you want to call it, but a lot of it is people searching out confirmation bias, looking to sort of reinforce their own beliefs rather than necessarily being, impacted by the algorithm, as people say.
I would be very curious to see a study done that looks into that two different camps, because I have, anecdotally have seen a lot of people be very scared of AI, right? And everything that they don't like, they say, oh, that's AI, like that's not real. And then there is like this big contingency that now rely on AI for everything, on what they eat for breakfast, to how they're going to travel. And I think the solution to this is the most boring solution, which is digital citizenship, educating our society, everyone from like 4th grade, on how to disparse information, how to analyze it, how to critically think, which is the hardest part of that.
Yeah. Well, that's a perfect segue
Yes.
into Alice, some stories that you
Please.
found this week. So if you want to talk about
Okay.
the stories that you had.
Yes. So I have 2 stories. I'll talk about them super briefly, and then we can.
Yeah.
We've already kind of made the point, which is like, yes, teach. No, if you have kids, teach them how to think critically, please. So for anybody who doesn't know, I worked at dating apps for 13 years, and a lot of the work that I did there was sort of grappling with this expectation for users of really strong safety mechanisms, which were really useful, and also kind of lack of control of like, well, humans are going to be human and they're going to do really weird stuff, and especially if they're meeting in person, like we can't really control that, and all the things that can come with those issues. And now we're seeing some of that with AI, which is like you can put safety guardrails in AI, and that's really important. And that's actually like a lot of what I do in my day job in Musubi is thinking about those things. And humans are going to be weird. And there has to be this balance between letting people explore and use AI in creative ways and also having guardrails. So there's two stories. One is from Rolling Stone, which is people who have body dysmorphia are using AI to like brutally rate their look and explain to them all the things that are wrong with them. And it was just like obviously causing harm for those folks. And so the article is sort of like, you know, where's the responsibility to prevent this kind of harm? And this is, again, like you were saying, some of these problems are not new. Like people in trust and safety have been dealing with eating disorders and other harm types for forever. But now you have this like interaction with a bot that is reflecting back what you want to hear, even if it's really dangerous. So that was one. And then the others in Forbes, and is announcing that one of the co-founders of Casper is starting an AI therapy company and talking about how so many people don't have access to mental health and you can really revolutionize things by using AI, which is great. And like I've personally used AI for like, oh my God, my son just had like an hour-long meltdown and I don't know what to do and what can I try tomorrow to try to calm him down easier. And also used AI for like, hey, help me figure out like healthy balanced meals and how many calories are in them. And, you know, those are really, really good. And also, you know, the trust and safety side of me is like, no, like, don't use AI for therapy. Like that is gonna go so wrong. And similarly, like, don't use AI to count calories. Like that is gonna send people down rabbit holes like we saw with the body dysmorphia thing. So I think the common thread here is like, is the user, is the person able to think critically and recognize how to put up their own safety guardrails and how to kind of think critically and be like, oh, this isn't so good for me. And unfortunately, especially in the US, like that is not something that we teach or support or celebrate with people at all. We're kind of just like left out to find scraps of, you know, how to learn these things. And now we're faced with this unprecedented technology that can mirror all of those problems back at you so quickly. So I don't have answers. I don't like the idea of having such strict controls with any technology that like it becomes so restrictive people can't use it for good and for helpful reasons. It's like the free speech advocate in me. And also as a safety professional, I'm like, we really need those guardrails and we really need to figure it out, and I don't know how to reconcile it.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is the theme of the podcast since we started it, which is like, gosh, there are no easy answers here. There's just a whole bunch of complexities and trade-offs. And I think these two stories were like really good examples of that, because you can look at both of those stories. The body dysmorphia one is a little bit trickier, but see where like there are benefits to using the technology to help people when it's used well. And the problem is that there are all sorts of examples of it not being used well. And then the question is, what do you do about it? And there is the sort of instinctual reaction, which is like, well, if it can be used badly, we have to figure out a way to stop it. But the only way you're really going to stop it is to then take away a whole bunch of the good uses as well. And as you said, you know, if you were trying to use it for checking calories or something in a good way, and some of the AI systems that you were using wouldn't let you do that, and you know that that's because there's a safety professional who looked at it and said, well, oh, no, we have to make sure that the AI is not encouraging, you know, eating disorder behavior.
Yeah, but then it also feels really frustrating.
Yes.
Restricting as a user, it's like, I'm not, you know, I just want to figure out how to eat healthier breakfast without like totally overeating today. But yeah, it's tricky.
This is, again, most of my job is fighting with the government, so I'm just going to talk about fighting with the government. A few years ago, a California state legislator introduced a bill that didn't go anywhere. But the bill wanted to fight body dysmorphia and all the problems a lot of young girls face by forcing social media companies to somehow figure out when someone uploads a picture if it was photoshopped. Didn't go anywhere. I had to spend a lot of time explaining why that A doesn't work, B doesn't help. And I feel like it's stuff like that, but like, okay, we have this issue with chatbots and them probably triggering a lot of issues that people have, or maybe even, maybe someone doesn't have an issue and that like leads them down the rabbit hole, you don't know. But at the same time, I know I sound like a broken record, but I'm a 90s kid. All of my body image issues came from TV and newspapers and magazines telling me that Jessica Simpson was fat when she was size 6. So again, like it's a repetitive thing where maybe trust and safety teams at generative AI companies can figure out what is the model that they want to offer, and then we as users figure out which model do we want to use.
I mean, I think there's there are a whole bunch of different issues at play here, which also makes it more complex and more confusing in terms of how do you deal with it, because all of these issues have parallels that predate AI, predate the internet. Issues with eating disorder go back.
There's a forum on Reddit, I'm pretty sure, where you upload your photo and you ask others to rate you.
Yes.
Well, does anybody remember hotornot.com?
Yeah.
Forever? If you're my age, probably. Yeah, like I totally used that. It was terrible. I was a teenager. Bad idea.
But so then what I think, and so there are definitely people who will say, well, but the technology makes it different. And the fact that the technology company is there as an intermediary then puts some level of responsibility on the technology company. And I don't think any of us think that the technology company should be like, well, we're not going to do anything. But I think that there's this over focus on the intermediary, the technology company, to solve this problem. And there's this idea that, if only the company could, magically step in, they could fix it so that the good uses, no problem, the bad uses will be blocked. And I think that's an unrealistic expectation. And I don't know how you deal with that, because there's always going to be some problem, and there's always going to be, and forgive my profession, but there's always going to be some journalist who's going to write a story that is like, here's this big, huge scandal. There's always going to be politicians who are going to say, oh my gosh, there was this horrible thing that happened. You need to do something. How could you have let that happen? I mean, how do we, my concern about all this is that I still think, and I get yelled at, and people in the audience are free to yell at me if you want. We did say you could heckle. So I lost my train of thought, but my fear is that in doing that and getting to the point where all of the decisions are being made because someone gets angry, there's a media or a politician who says something, we take away from the discussion about like, how do we teach people to use these tools properly in the first place? Is it citizenship? Is it, the media literacy? Is it technology literacy? Is it, when and how in schools do we train people to better understand, to be appropriately skeptical when they should be appropriately skeptical, to be willing to test out and try and experiment in ways that is useful for them to learn and experiment and sometimes learn where things go wrong. I think all of those things are important, and yet that discussion gets pushed away in favor of, oh my gosh, there's this horrible thing happening that needs to stop. And I on this podcast many times I've talked about the importance of media literacy, and I've had people yell at me saying that, well, that takes too long.
Yes, but
Thank you.
But we've also had these kinds of scapegoats for forever. So when I was a teenager, it was like, heavy metal music and Dungeons and Dragons were gonna make everybody terrible. I think I turned out okay. But it's like that scapegoating of social responsibility and saying we as a society are doing just fine. It's just this one thing that it's turning everybody bad, I think is a natural thing, and we're going to keep seeing it, and there's going to be something else next time. And if we have been providing some of these tools and some of these skills the whole time, or like proper mental health support for everybody, universal health insurance, crazy ideas, then it might not be such a big problem. But I think, it's normal for people in charge of the government to kind of want to make it somebody else's problem and not their own.
Yeah.
My parents wouldn't let me have a Tamagotchi because they saw on TV that like 2 kids killed themselves when their Tamagotchi died. And I still want one if anyone has one. Just let me know.
I was going to say, and look how you turned out.
But I feel like this really brings me to the idea of like, with great power comes great responsibility, but the responsibility should be on us, right? Like, we have this great power of generative AI now at our hands, and the responsibility shouldn't be in the tool. It should be on us, and that's the hard media literacy it takes forever thing. But no matter how much you limit the tool, it will always have problems because humans always have problems.
Yeah. All right. With that, I want to move on to our last story. And this is not officially about AI, though there's always an AI element to absolutely everything these days. This we thought would be a really good story to sort of close out the discussion and to close out TrustCon, because it was a really interesting, sort of thought-provoking piece in Tech Policy Press by Dean Jackson. I'm a huge fan of Dean. I think he does some really, really great reporting and is very, very knowledgeable on trust and safety issues, including a lot of the nuances. But this one, I was like, I'm not sure I agree with it. And because it's one of these things where I'm not sure I agree with it, it's fun to talk about it with people. And so it's called A Realist Perspective on Trust and Safety. And it's worth going and reading. I have a couple quotes from it, but part of what he's arguing is that over the last 4 or 5 years, with things like TrustCon and TSPA and Integrity Institute and all these other organizations that have sprung up to sort of support the trust and safety field, there was this feeling of this sort of groundswell of support for like, oh yes, let's make the internet safe. And that maybe has changed a bit in the last year. Some of you may have noticed. It may have infected some of the way that people have felt about this conference and the conversations that we're having. It's certainly a part of the discussion. And so his argument is like, if you take a realist perspective on this idea that this effort to build up these organizations to help make the internet safer in a way that doesn't involve necessarily the government coming in and telling people how to do things, that may have failed. And is sort of suggesting that we have to take a realist view and suggest that experiment is over. And so one quote he had said, a realist assessment of the current moment suggests that instead of the one force capable of moving tech titans in a better direction, he says, perhaps the only force short of a mass consumer movement is state power. And then he addresses this, but it strikes me as at a moment when some of us in this audience are quite concerned about the nature of state power and where it is today and how it is being used and how many things that may have been put in place for good reason are being weaponized to target people who are challenging the lines or policies of this administration. That the idea of saying, well, we can't do it collectively as a group here, the only answer is state power. I hope that's not true. And I'm hoping that there are other ways to deal with this, and that kind of what I'm hoping we can discuss a little bit. How did you, I know, I sent this to you and I had both of you read it. What was your reaction on reading Dean's piece?
I think similar to you, there's some regulation that we've seen that is helpful and sort of refer back and say, look, give me more resources, I have to do it. And that can be really good. I think also similarly, especially in the US, if you read some of the things that are happening, it's like all pornography is totally evil, and some of the goals to like shut it down completely for everybody, and not only for adults. And it's like we can't rely on government to be sensible, especially when it comes to protecting marginalized groups. So I agree. I'm worried about that. I think the other part of it is one of the points that he makes in the article is sort of this idea that proving the ROI of trust and safety didn't work. Like people tried to make that argument, and it just ended up that like nobody, like the business motive for investing in trust and safety just isn't there, because you see companies like X who are laying off tons of people and really cutting down. And so therefore it's proof, like, people still use it. So why do it in the first place? I don't think that's the full story. I think for a long time we've seen, especially the big global platforms, have these one-size-fit-all policies. They're all they were the same. They had like very generic, everybody's welcome, everything's cool, but they weren't going to take hard stances. Now we're seeing X go off in one direction, but we're also seeing other companies start to like take a really solid stance and say like, no, trust and safety is really important, and we're going to use that as a differentiator, and we're going to invest in our teams. Our CEO is going to talk about trust and safety openly. And some of it might just be PR stunts. Like, I don't work for these companies, so I don't know for sure. But like Roblox is the sponsor of, the main sponsor here. I also see other people who are talking, like Pinterest CEO talks a ton about trust and safety. And I find it really fascinating because a few years ago, that was like not something that CEOs would talk about that much. So I think the business case is still open. And I would love to see more companies differentiate themselves in that way.
Yeah, I think I think the story on the business case has not been told yet. I think it's way too early. I mean, TrustCon has been around for 4 years. The term trust and safety, as generally applied to the field, was like about that long, right? I remember a few conferences before TrustCon existed, and the trust and safety was not even sort of widely accepted as a term. The idea of like figuring out metrics and ROI on it is not there yet. And it's one of these things that I hope, and maybe this is wishful thinking, that companies will sort of naturally realize that, yes, there are these efforts to like, and I know like last year I tried to go to a panel on ROI on trust and safety, and I couldn't get in because it was packed and I showed up early. So there's obviously a lot of interest in sort of figuring that out. But I think it is still early, and people are still trying to figure that out. But we have a parallel, which is the sort of customer support that many companies, in the 80s and 90s, a lot of companies viewed customer support as a cost center, and you wanted to make it as cheap as possible, offshore as much as possible. Give people. You can only be on the phone for 30 seconds. You have to get people off the phone as quick as possible. And then some companies smartly began to realize, like, wait, this is like one of our major customer touch points. We should be viewing this more as a marketing function and a beneficial function rather than a cost center that we have to try and minimize. And we're seeing, I think, as you noted, some companies are recognizing that for trust and safety as well. So I think it's a little premature to say, well, the whole attempt to prove ROI was a failure. I think there's still time on that.
Yeah, and also, not to set you up for a big rant here, but there's a lot of really promising stuff happening with user-based moderation or decentralized platforms. Like Discord's doing a lot of really cool stuff. Blue Sky's doing a lot of really cool stuff. You see a lot of that was
Ben is not here with a bell, but I am.
Mike is on the board.
I'm on the board of Blue Sky, so consider me biased. Yeah.
No, but I think like we're getting the tools finally for people to be involved, like you were talking about before. Like, give users choice, give users autonomy over their own experience, give them tools. Those are finally technically possible now, and that's setting up, I think, for hopefully this like consumer revolution where people are like, I can have a hand in creating my own experience and making things better. And that's trust and safety, not just as like a centralized function within a company, but also as like a back and forth with users, which I think is really promising. We're like super at the beginning of possibilities there.
I was having a lot of cognitive dissonance when I was like, okay, so this piece says, love you, Dean. This piece says, this is the issue. Trust and safety has been suffering because of the current political climate and everything that has happened. So the solution is to give the government that currently I'm criticizing power over this. So that was the part that I was like really struggling with understanding. But the second piece is, depending on business model, of course, but even if maybe platforms are not advertising or saying in DC loudly that they're pro trust and safety, they still have advertisers. They still have money to make, and if there is something hateful or horrible next to an ad, probably the advertiser is not going to want that. And that's going to be another piece of kind of influence over them. And maybe we're in currently the mood and the vibe is bad, right? Like historically, we're just like here, whatever the like lowest point is on Earth, like it's like some what is it called in English? It starts with an M.
I don't know.
No, okay. Trivia for thank you. But yes, we're here, but like historically, we're probably gonna go up. Like when you hit the bottom and you knock, then you go up. So maybe the mood around trust and safety is gonna change. And if we don't wait for it to change or for these discussions, we want them to stop and then give the government the power to decide, like, then we're really screwed.
Yeah, I think there's an element of, I think, and everybody does this, and I certainly do this, where you sort of over-index on the way things are now and sort of assume that we're in a steady state and that the world isn't changing. But the world is changing, and the world continues to change, and these things do cycle, and there is some sort of pendulum. And so, yes, obviously, I think, within certain circles, trust and safety is looked down upon or considered the enemy of progress in certain circles. But I don't think it needs to stay that way. And I think there are these other forces at play, and some of it is advertisers, but it's also the users. And again, like Dean actually, he makes this point in there that like, he seems a little skeptical that the users will actually stand up and do things. But I am hopeful also, and again, bias, whatever, like with things like Blue Sky and, which has custom feeds and third-party ability to create different moderation systems and all of these other tools, people are beginning to discover that you can do it. And I've said this a few times before, but like we've had, 15, 20 years of these centralized systems where people were sort of taught and became accustomed to the idea that you were not in control of your online experience, that someone else was in control, and they might not have your best interests at heart, but there wasn't much you could do about it other than maybe use those same tools to yell at the people who run those platforms or to yell at the government to make the people who run those platforms change it. Whereas we're beginning to see these elements that are showing up where like, wait, you can make a difference yourself. You can take some control over it, or third parties can come in and build other services on top of it that can take control. And that creates this element of there's innovation, so you can see like different approaches to dealing with these things and decide that you might like the way somebody else wants to handle moderation or handle these things. And that will spur more people to begin to recognize, this is theoretical, this is hopeful, but like we'll begin to recognize that there are other ways to do this rather than saying, you giant company has to solve this, or you government has to tell the company how to solve this thing.
I agree.
You're supposed to yell at me about that. I think that's a good sign that we can start moving to audience questions. If anyone wants to, gosh, you guys are nervous.
Any content moderation stories from the past week or 2 weeks that you guys want to discuss?
There are microphones. I'll remind people there are microphones over on either side. I see at least one person running to a microphone, and so we can take questions. We have another 10 minutes or so, I believe. So we have somebody lined up at the microphone. You there? Go first.
Hi, I'm Ann Collier with the Net Safety Collaborative, and I think partly it's just we're all very tired.
Yes.
But thank you all. This is a fascinating discussion, and I just wanted to follow up on that last point. I am such a fan of decentralized. I think that we need to empower the user more, and I think we need to even get down to giving individual users their own their very own bots or their very own AI to do their own personal content moderation. But then there's children, right? And we do need to empower them as well. But I'm not sure decentralized or, having these fantastic sort of third-party apps in a decentralized space is gonna keep them safe. So I was just wondering if you all could comment on that, those who aren't properly educated yet, to take control and also to keep adults from taking too much control so that they don't have their own agency and freedom of expression.
I can start on that, and then yeah, I think that gets back to the discussion that we had in the first part, the first two parts of this, where it's like these technologies can be used for good and bad, and really sort of a lot of what it comes down to is helping people understand, teach them how to use it well. But also part of that is not expecting that everyone will use it perfectly, but that there is this sort of learning experience. And this is something that a lot of us who are older, ancient, learned as a child, is that, you sort of learn as you grow about things that are appropriate, sort of age appropriate as you go, and sometimes you make mistakes. And part of growing up is learning, is making those mistakes and learning. That's not saying it should be a free-for-all, and that, kids will learn, they'll mess up and encounter terrible things, and they'll learn from that. No, not always, right? But I think that there's an approach that has to do with not just the tech companies being responsible or the AI bot companion being responsible, but family, society, schools, sort of saying, we're going to teach you how to use these things appropriately, and we're not going to lie to you that everything is perfect online, that you have to be aware that occasionally you might come across issues, and sort of figuring out, in an age-appropriate way, begin to train people to learn how to use these tools properly. And I think that is, it's not a sexy solution, it's not an easy solution, and it's not going to work perfectly, but I think it's the most reasonable solution.
The two things, as we have that discussion, very important discussion, that I want to flag is currently the government is trying to mandate age verification and basically get rid of anonymous speech online and encroach on a lot of other rights. And I think a centralized system in the name of kids, a lot of really bad laws are being passed in the name of kids. So just keep that in mind, have that conversation. When you have that conversation, discuss this piece too.
Yeah, I think we can go to that.
We can go on to next.
Hi, everybody. My question might be a bit strange. I remember during the sort of takeover of Twitter and all the changes and the shift that went away, the users were leaving and looking for something else. And someone made a comment, why are we trying to replace Twitter? Isn't the problem maybe systemic in digital systems, how they work, how they remove humanity in conversation and interactions? Could that be the answer then, to just embrace more offline community? And if that is the case, then how would you suggest that happen?
I mean, again, no easy answers at all. I think there's some element of, yes, go touch grass and live in the world. I moved to the middle of the woods so that I would have a nice balance of my online life and my offline life. And also, I remember being a teenager in the South who was figuring out my sexuality and feeling really out of place and feeling really lonely. Nobody understood me, and people on the internet understood me and gave me support, and that's where I found who I was and found, myself able to express myself in a way that felt authentic, where I couldn't in person. And then I became brave enough to also do it in person, but it took a while, and it was the internet. And I think a ton of people have those experiences, and going back to the child safety issue, especially as teenagers. And so you have to kind of balance these things, especially as our IRL lives become more polarized and people become more closed-minded and more hateful. It may become harder and harder and harder for people to find that support and acceptance that they need in their own communities. And so I wish that wasn't true. I wish we, didn't have that problem. But while we do have that problem, the internet is a solution as much as it is a problem.
It was Tumblr for me. I think for Twitter, yes, there's this very specific community that exists that sometimes is still very fun, but like astronomer CEO thing, that was a great day on the internet. I'm sorry to him and whatever he's going for. But at the same time, I think, for example, I'm a millennial. My younger siblings are all like very Gen Z. They're not on Twitter. They have their own communities on Discord, on TikTok that have completely different dynamics. That maybe there's an exodus from one of those communities. They face similar questions. So I think it's also a generational thing where it's not like Twitter is going to be around at least in this form forever. I think it's like technology comes and goes and people find community online.
Yeah, the only thing I'll add is that sometimes, technology can also help people meet in real life and go outside and all those kinds of things. Want to go to the question over here?
Sure. So a lot of the latter part of the discussion was, I think, kind of selling the idea of empower users, let them choose, create competition, essentially. I mean, there's definitely, I think, a strong kind of critique of that view. Not that it's not a good idea, it's a great idea, just that it's really difficult to happen in practice when your friends are in certain places. Like if your friends are on TikTok, you're not going to go to Twitter. You know what I mean? It has to do, it's very difficult to move. And options like Blue Sky are really good, but it's still difficult for people to move. One of the areas where maybe state intervention could be considered is in terms of like mandating, say, competitive interoperability. And I wonder if that's something you've thought about, if you have reflections on that.
Yeah, we have like 2 minutes left. I could go on for about an hour on that particular subject. The really quick version is, I think incentives work better than mandates. And there are attempts to mandate those kinds of things. And I think what will be found is that they fail. And if they fail badly, they'll be damaging to the wider space and the idea of doing these things. Where if you put in place a mandate for like interoperability or data portability, companies will often figure out the least friendly way to do it, the way to comply, as opposed to the way to actually make it useful. And so I fear where that ends up, even though I sort of appreciate the thinking behind it and like, yes, we're trying to get there. I would love to think through, and I have, as I said, probably an hour on this, of like ways to create better incentives to make companies think it's a great idea for them to do that without it being the government saying you absolutely have to do it this way. But that's a much longer story. I think we have time for one more relatively quick question, and then we will close up and let everybody go to happy hours and drinks.
Thanks so much. You mentioned earlier that advertisers, hold the significant power in recentering the importance of trust and safety, and that their spending can have this major influence. I was at a recent brand safety conference, and I heard a very high-profile brand suggest that actually, audience tolerance has shifted, and we're no longer quite as concerned. The tolerance level isn't there. So when you mention our ad for our product appearing aside around content that would previously have been an absolute no-go, that they're more open to it. What is your response or reaction to that kind of narrative?
I think if that's true, maybe someone was just trying to get a big bonus that year by being original. But if that's true, if that really reflects where the society in that country is, maybe that's what it is. I grew up in Russia. I'm Armenian myself. There's so many different cultural things that have changed over the course of my life and what society accepts. And then I moved here and I learned a lot of new things and a lot of new words. So I think there's just like something about, if that statement is true, then they win and they're ahead of the curve. And if it's not, their business model fails as advertisers, and there is we've seen this a lot.
And just for context, and you don't have to include this on the podcast, but that was Unilever.
Fascinating. Well, but we've seen a lot of times society negatively react to advertisers thinking it's going one way and then it's going the other way. For example, there's always conversation about trad wives and how that's like very mainstream right now, and I actually don't know if there's enough data to say that it is.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. I think we'll see how, society is changing, the culture is changing, and sort of how people respond to it is something that we're all going to learn together. But we're all sort of able to influence that in our own ways as well. And so I think, we'll sort of see how that goes. We are out of time, but before we close, I do. This is Alice had told me she was going to do this at the beginning. And
I
then
forgot at the beginning.
I
Can
forgot
do
at the
can I do
beginning
it
too,
now?
so you can do it
Okay.
now.
Yes. Before we go, huge thank you to TSPA and everybody involved in TrustCon, all the volunteers who have been making this possible.
And then thanks to all of you for coming out. We are the final thing at TrustCon, and we assume that many people, want to leave early and not hang out. And so we are incredibly grateful to a crowd this big coming out to see us and to cheer and yell and occasionally heckle.
Yeah, not as much heckling as I hoped. So
Next year.
Yeah.
Next year, come with heckles.
thank you.
Yay.